Okay, so I propose we start because we have a rather full program. So bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, according to the place where you are. I am France Mellet, researcher at the French Institute for Demographic Studies, INED, l'Institut National d'Études Démographiques. And it's my great pleasure to chair this special session, which was sponsored by my institute. I think that as demographers, we are all aware that data are very important. And for most of our analysis, data must be available, but also of good quality, and as well as comparable in time and space. And in the recent years, INED has reinforced its contribution to this field of demographic research by developing different databases, which are all in open access. So in this session, we intend to present some of these databases, essentially those devoted to mortality and health data, to have them more known in our demographic community. So after a short general presentation, we will have two methodological papers explaining the complex work which is necessary to build these databases, and sometimes it's a little not well estimated how difficult it can be to achieve, to produce these resources. And then, maybe more funny, we will have two papers which will give you some examples of results which can be obtained using this open access data. So let's start. The interpretation is available in French, so feel free to hear, to listen to this either in French or in English. And now, Nancy, please, let's start with a presentation by Arianna Caporali, who is responsible for the data lab at INED and for these databases. So please.
Hello, I am the responsible of INED's Data Lab, and today I introduce this session sponsored by INED. I will present the Data Lab and its mortality and health databases that will be further presented by the other speakers in this session. INED is among the main European research institutes in demography. INED researchers work together together with research support services on 8 main themes, including fertility, mortality, migration, family, health, aging, etc. We produce survey data as well as demographic and contextual databases. The Data Lab was created in 2019 to develop open data and strengthen access to INED survey data and its demographic and contextual databases. We have a website that provides links to INED survey data catalogs and the other databases. More in particular, we contribute to 9 databases, mainly international databases, including demographic indicators, and in some cases also socioeconomic and political indicators. These databases are tailored to provide reliable research data with rigorous data collection procedures, often together with country specialists, and data quality checks. They also provide rich data documentation. Data access is free and user-friendly. I will now focus on 3 health and mortality databases that will be further presented in this session. The first one is the demography of COVID-19 deaths database that provides death counts attributable to COVID-19 by sex and age and, when possible, by places and dates of occurrence of the deaths. It covers 21 countries with weekly updates, and it is open access. The added value of this database is that it provides very detailed documentation about the data sources. As shown in the graph for England and Wales, COVID-19 mortality trends can indeed vary much depending on the characteristics of the data collection system, even within the same country. The database was launched in April 2020, and it is used in a number of publications. For more information, there is a poster and a paper in this conference, and in this session, a presentation by Jenny Garcia and another one by Iram Beltran-Sánchez. The second database is the Human Cause of Death database that provides mortality data by sex and age according to constant classification of causes of death since the 50s for 16 countries. Access is free after registration. As shown in the graph for Ukraine, the added value of this database is that it is possible to study mortality time series that are not disrupted by periodical changes in the disease classifications. Launched in 2016, it is used in more than 70 publications, and it is jointly developed by INED, the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, and the University of California. To learn more about this database, there will be a presentation by Marketa Pesholdova. Finally, we have the International Database on Longevity, which provides data on deceased aged between 105 and 109 years and 110 plus, the so-called supercentenarians. It covers 13 countries, and it is, the access is free after registration. The added value of this database is that it provides validated data to study mortality at the oldest ages. It is used in a number of publications, including 2 monographs. The database is developed by a network of researchers. It is maintained by INED since 2020. There will be a new website with updated data next year, and also a workshop. To learn more about this database, we will have a presentation by Francisco Villavicencio. In the future, we would like to improve compliance with the FAIR principles, attribute DOIs to our databases, as well as Creative Commons license. Thank you very much. And here you have the Data Lab team, in particular Etienne Coupier, Iris Surani, and Svitlana Poniakina, who are the ones working on our health and mortality databases.
Okay, thank you very much, Ariana, for this first presentation. And maybe without waiting, we will turn to Jenny Garcia, who is going to speak more precisely about the DC COVID databases. So please, Nancy, and then Jenny for the presentation.
Morning, everybody. My name is Jenny Garcia, and I am part of the operational team of the demographic of COVID-19 death database, a gateway to well-documented international data. In March 2020, when the ongoing pandemic started, several attempts to collect and analyze COVID-19 related data took place within the scientific community and beyond. National governments and international organizations look for the best real-time indicator available to measure the spread of the virus. The daily count of COVID-19 death quickly became a key indicator to monitor the health crisis. And so INED stepped in to contribute to this massive challenge. A group of researchers started putting together COVID-19 death counts published by the national authorities of a dozen countries. And more importantly, giving guidelines for his interpretation in international comparison. The demographic of COVID-19 death database is one of many COVID-19 related international databases. So I will focus my presentation on what I consider the four main characteristics that distinguish this database from others. The first one is that it provides updated cumulative numbers of deaths attributed to COVID by age and sex, which is important for demographers, but also by place of death when possible, and by differentiating the death according to the date of occurrence, the date of report to the national authorities, and the date of publication to the general public, which enable a more accurate way to keep track of the pandemic. So far, the database includes death counts of 21 countries coming from 28 data sources. These are mostly European countries, and we have also Canada and United States from the Americas, and Japan and South Korea from Asia. The database was launched in April 2020 and collects cumulative death counts since February 2020 up to now. The death counts attributed to COVID are mainly flawed statistics. Data have different coverage, their publication have different periodicity. Data is even published in different formats, since proper database files to image in dashboard or PDF files. This is why the second characteristic of this database, it is its constant quality check. The operational team is continuously checking the accuracy of the counts that we publish, and they are included in the database. In fact, for including a country or a source in the database, there is a long process of validation. The operational teams contacts a national expert to provide feedbacks about the most reliable data source in the country. This national expert revises the documentation that we designed for the country data, metadata files, and explanatory notes. Once validated, the documentation passed to a member of the operational team who is selected as a country specialist. The member will be in charge of further data and metadata updates. Until June 2020, data was published, was updated daily, even during weekends, and nowadays all daily data published by the sources are updated weekly. Another main characteristic of the database is that it's user-friendly, and this is really important because the database is designed in a way that users with different expertise levels could benefit from it. So it is useful to inform the research community, but also beyond this group. The database has useful resources for non-specialist users, such as single country data and metadata files in which a detailed description of the source and data in use are displayed. Each single country page contains all published data up to date and all official documentation from which we have taken the data. The database also includes practical recommendations from interpreting death counts, and it gives a graphical representation to monitor the development of the pandemic through a ratio of weekly death to total population in the 21 countries. For the researchers, there are a set of pooled data files by age and sex, by place of death, the total death by publication date, the total death by occurrence date, and a pooled data file with the population estimation for each country from 2019 to 2021 when possible. There are also other important materials such as a codebook and a pool metadata file. And it is possible to merge all pool dataset files with the metadata files. In addition, there is an interactive dashboard with information on data availability and their comparability based on the pool metadata files. Metadata are systematized into variables and categories, and their changes are related to the specific day in which they took place. And here comes what is probably the most important contribution of the database. That is how users could benefit from the detailed description and systematization of the metadata for accurate international analysis of the pandemic. And this is particularly important because even in high-income countries with a long history of demographic data collection, COVID-19 death counts have been collected in a heterogeneous way. What is counted as a death attributed to COVID-19 vary from country to country, even from one source to another within the same country. And of course, it could also vary over time within the same source. Statistics reported through health system institutions usually focus on cases where infection from COVID-19 has been confirmed by a laboratory test, while statistics reported to the death registration system usually include any death with a mention of COVID-19 on the certificate. For some countries, such as Sweden or Denmark, reported death counts attributed to COVID-19 refer to positive tested cases in which the virus was indeed the underlying cause of death. Most of the system monitoring mortality data are designed for annual reviews, such as the vital statistics. These data pass through rigorous quality protocols and process that requires a considerable amount of time. Other system processing immediate information, such as those designed for epidemiological surveillance. Other system processing immediate information, such as those designed for epidemiological surveillance, report less accurate data. As a result, by nature, the COVID-19 data available in real time are imperfect. Difference between reporting system coverage and case definition and their changes through time may induce artifactual patterns when analyzing the pandemic. Since the launch of the database, we identify some key characteristics of the COVID-19 related death counts that impact the reports and are often intertwined. Data may come from surveillance systems or the CRVS system, or from the transmission from local authorities and hospitals to a central institution. As follow, these different reporting systems have different coverage. Some reporting systems counted only hospital deaths or deaths occur within the health system, whereas other counted deaths occur in all places. In addition, death counts may include only positive tested cases or positive and probable cases. It means cases in which symptoms are noticed and high-risk contact was established, but there was no deaths. There is also different confirmation mechanisms in place by the country depending on the reporting system, if laboratory confirmation or underlying cause of death. This basic information was not obvious or easily available for all the countries, neither static since the beginning of the pandemic. And I would like to show you two examples of these changes. The first example is Spain. At the beginning of the pandemic, up to May 2020, Spain had two parallel reporting systems. The first one comes from the Renave surveillance system, which coverage remained limited to the death occurred within the health system, and came mainly from individuals who have laboratory confirmation of the virus. The second source was the death counts published by the Ministry of Health, Consumption, and Social Welfare. This data comes from the transmission from local authorities and hospitals to a central institution. This count tells about death occurring in hospital and from individuals that were tested positive or manifesting symptoms after high-risk contact. Two sources stopped publishing data by age and sex at the end of May 2020. 2 months after, on July 17, a new series of counts started, and death counts by age and sex were published. This time, the death counts include those occur in all places and from positive tested cases. The changes in the reporting system brought an increase of almost 30% of the previous reported death. In Austria, which is another important example, up to November 4, 2020, there were two data sources in Austria for the COVID-19 death. One was the epidemiological reporting system, which counted the deaths of individuals who tested positive for COVID-19 and occurred in all places, the death. and the Ministry of Social Affairs, Health Care and Consumer Protection that report individuals who tested positive, but in which COVID-19 was indeed the underlying cause of death. The two sources published death by date of report, and the difference between them, let's say May 1st, 2020, was about 24 deaths. Since November 4, 2020, the report count from the minister is stopped, and we only have those from the epidemiological reporting system. And from July 2007 onwards, the epidemiological reporting system started publishing data by date of occurrence. This change led to a revision on all deaths reported since March 2020. And nowadays, the official count of COVID-19 attributed death for May 1st, 2020 is 630. Like these examples, differences and changes in the reporting system, COVID-19 case definition and coverage of death counts, among other variables, have been systematized in the pool metadata file and easily accessible in our interactive dashboard. We invite to all users to consult this dashboard and check for the most suitable data for the international comparison. The dashboard is an inventory of the data available in the database linked to a reference date. And users might check the characteristic of the data they need, if age and sex, daughter, or place of death, select the specific characteristic and the country of their interest. As closing remark, I would like to say that the demography of COVID-19 death database is the only database collecting, updating, and systematizing the metadata associated to COVID-19 attributed mortality. Detailed metadata allows users taking informed decisions regarding the most suitable data for the comparative analysis, as well as understanding the main limitations. The data provided by the database are useful for keeping track of the pandemic, of course, but also for methodological comparisons between reporting systems. And lastly, users have continuous access to all data contained in the database, previous release files, and official documentation for each country at any time they want. Finally, I would like to thank all our collaborators and thank you for your attention, of course, and invite you to future presentations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. So I forgot to tell you, but I imagine you know that you have some, if you have some question, you can write them in the chat and authors can answer later on. Is there any question? We can also take a few questions right now if you want to ask something specific to Jenny right now. Wait a minute. Nothing occurring. So we will keep some time for general discussion at the end of all the presentation. And maybe I will now give the floor to Markéta Pekoldová, who is going to present the human cause of death database and the way coherent series are reconstructed for these databases. So Nancy, please, the next presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Markéta Majrová, and the topic of my talk is to describe and explain the methods used in production of data series, which are presented in an online database with the name Human Cause of Death Database and the logo presented on the slide here. Regarding causes of death in general, there is a huge amount of cause-specific data collected for much more than a century now in many developed countries. These data are also quite systematic in a way that they are classified in a standardized way in a classification which exists for quite a long time, and it's been established and recognized as standard in many countries. This classification to reflect medical progress is revised approximately every 10 years. And currently we are at the 10th revision, but with an ongoing and long implementation of ICD-11. Not every country has adopted the international standard or international classification since the beginning. And a prominent example are countries of Russia and the ex-USSR, which only implemented ICD from its 10th revision, while using previously their own version of classification, or Germany, which implemented ICD from the 8th revision, again using a proper classification system, which was not very different from ICD, but it was not ICD. On the other hand, there are countries like France and Czech Republic, which have been using ICD since the very beginning. Now, speaking about ICD revisions, what's the impact? I mean, the impact is disruption in the continuity of time series. And this picture quite illustrates it quite well. At first, so this is heart diseases split into categories or groups of diseases, and the time axis shows the revisions of ICD here, covering data for France from 1922 to 2007, and covering revisions from the 3rd to the 10th revision. So here we see the interval of the adoption or duration of the classification, and below we see how data is affected. So first thing is that the classification is getting more and more detailed, which we see as splitting of the curves. And second, diseases change names, but also change definitions. So just using these raw data, what we call raw, is not possible to track diseases back in time. Therefore, there is a task of bridging the ICD revisions to achieve continuity in time series. And the question is how to do it. And the good news is that you don't have to do it yourself, because there is this database which has been established and which I think will be described elsewhere in this session or in other sessions. So just in brief, there are 16 countries and the reconstructed and documented series for all the 16 countries listed here. This is the homepage of the database, and the link will be given in the end of the talk. So basically, two methods or two groups of methods were used to achieve the continuous time series, which are presented in the database. The first method is the bridge coding, and the bridge coding was used just for the United States, which had the bridge coding study available. And using bridge coding has some advantages, such as it's easier to use from the beginning. It doesn't require many of the medical knowledge to produce hypothetical correspondences table. It also enables to compute directly the comparability ratios, which then allow for distribution of depths according to the older revision. This looks very nice, but applying it in real life brings some disadvantages. So disadvantage number one is the unavailability. For most of the countries, the bridge coding studies are unavailable. Second, the results are valid within the concerned country only, typically. Next, less frequent causes of death are underrepresented and so we cannot compute comparability ratios from the bridge coding. Next, the links are very complex. So at one point, there is a kind of a black box effect when everything links to a little bit of everything, and it's difficult to handle such a complex system. Another disadvantage, sorry, is that there are no standard guidelines about how to apply the bridge coding. So every work is a bit of an original. You have to decide yourself which age groups, whether you apply the comparability ratios separately by sex and so on. And in the end, you are still facing the need to validate the series for disruptions and so on. So this looks like there is more disadvantages than advantages, but that's not true. Bridge coding is a good method, and it has its place and its reasons, its rationale. So when I speak about complexity of exchanges and the black box effect, I would like to present how it looks like when we connect two ICD revisions. So this is a matrix of correspondences based on several bridge coding studies mixed together. And this is an XY axis system, where on the x-axis we have diseases according to ICD-10, so it's written in small letters, and on the y-axis there is ICD-9, and this diagonal line represents, or the dark dots represent numerous cases of correspondences. So when the dot is darker, there are more correspondences. So in this picture, what we see is actually first a signal and then a noise. We can interpret it this way. The signal is the diagonal line with numerous correspondences on the diagonal, and then there's the noise with rather non-systematic correspondences elsewhere. So it's also to realize how the relations between the two revisions can be plotted in this correspondence matrix. And it's a very important visualization also for the next method. Here is the result. One of the results, example of reconstruction of the US data. So in the dotted line, we see the series before reconstruction with several jumps at the moment of ICD change, and the smooth solid line represents the reconstructed series, which went well in this case of ischemic heart diseases. So this is also a difference between raw data and reconstructed data. Another group of methods, the dominant method used for reconstruction of time series presented in the human cause of death database is the correspondence-based method, or mostly known as the method produced by Franz Miller and Jacques Vallin from INED. This method also has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that it's respectful to medical and statistical continuity, that it is stepwise, allowing for coherence checks in each step, and it can build a knowledge base and develop this knowledge base for further applications. It's more, in this way, it's more universal than the bridge coding. The disadvantages is that it's quite laborious and can be subjective, because at some points decisions are made which are not clear or clearly defined. The solution is not unique. Again, if I divide the methods in steps, we can define something like a preliminary step or step 0. And again, we start with the correspondence matrix, like we had in the bridge coding. But here the correspondences are given by some theory, by some medical knowledge. In case of ICD-9 and ICD-10, such a correspondence exists. For other transitions, there is not a guideline or a list of correspondences. You would have to go individually and search for alphabetical indexes and look for diseases with the same definitions. Then you'd end up with a correspondence matrix like this. Again, there is this tag on a line, which is a bit interrupted, but it's not in the scope of this talk to present why. But the most important information is this clear diagonal line, giving some quite well-defined correspondence pattern between ICD-10 and ICD-9. So in the method, in the first step, and again, I divided it into step 1A, starting from this correspondence matrix, which can also be presented as correspondence table. We build fundamental association of items. So this here on the right is a small version of these huge correspondence matrices that we've seen. And on the left is how we proceed during the transformation of the correspondence matrix into the associations. So we look for clusters of diseases which are linked with each other and at the same time not linked to anything else in the list. So here, looking at the number 2 is the simplest case. It's a 1-to-1 association. So one item is linked to only one and nothing else. And it's one association by itself. Here, the cluster with the ones is another association. In this type, it's an N-to-N because we have N diseases from one classification related to N diseases from the other. Here it's 2 to 3 actually. So in this way, we can generate the list of fundamental associations. And by the end of the step, we have all the items classified in some of the fundamental associations. So within the project, we managed to automatize the step, and that also reduces the level of mistakes and subjectivity. In step 1B, once we have this structure of associations built, we connect the death counts and names to ease the work. So this is very small letters and a lot of information on one slide, but here on the left, we start with the association like we had here on the left, but here additionally it has death counts from one revision and from another, and the names of the diseases and the codes. And what we care about is the sum. So we gather these deaths for each association and we look at the sum, and we want the sums to be balanced or in accordance with the trends. So I'm deliberately not saying we want them to be the same, but we want them to be smooth or to be coherent. On the right panel, we show the trends for each item of the association, the death counts, but for both revisions. So at this step, we are here in the blue highlighted panel, showing disruptions and between ICD-10 and ICD-8 and ICD-9. So here on the panel B is where we want to get in the end. So that's the step for building fundamental associations, step 1B. Step 2, as I said, the method is stepwise and is checked for coherence at every step. So at this step, for the first time, we check for disruptions, for the totals, for the sums of the associations. And of course, we don't want them to be statistically disrupt. And for this, we developed with Giancarlo Camarda and with our team of the project a method of automated detection of disruptions based on adopting large number, but that was fitting our experience where we wanted disruption to be detected. So again, that's one of the, it's typically one of the subjective points here, whether we say 80 or 90, for example. So getting to step 3, it's the computing transition coefficients. Computing the transition coefficients takes place within the associations. And here again, it's just another way how to plot the items in the association here, cross-tabulated or cross-classified into fractions of portions of deaths from one revision, which are attributable to the items of the new revision. So the upper part of the table represents absolute death counts. In the lower part, we just do relative counts, or here per miles, so per 1,000, to sum up here to unity. Here it's unity across columns. We could do it row-wise. It depends on which direction we want to go. So this, again, can be done manually and also doesn't have a unique solution from time to time. So another point where decisions are made. Our colleague Giancarlo Camarda has elaborated a method of automated computation of transition coefficients. So again, starting here with the correspondence matrix, which has diseases from one classification in columns, diseases from other classification in rows, and the ones indicate the correspondence, 0 non-correspondence. For each of the correspondence, we are able to compute transition coefficient, and here, without going into too much detail, we can compute same transition coefficient for all the ages, or we can compute it by age, or what Giancarlo has came up with, we can produce smooth estimate over ages. So this is the result. It's for each matrix, there's a figure with a transition coefficient computed, and just look at this paper for more technical details. Step 4 would be the actual redistribution, the core of the method, where we recompute one item or one revision into another. And again, it's quite clearly described here in this matrix, which says that a portion of a disease to be redistributed is always a product of the T, which is the transition coefficient, and the C, which are the column sums or the row sums. Here it's in the direction of columns, but again, what matters is this distribution within this cross table or this matrix. So just by multiplicating and summing up, we do the actual redistribution. So that's not the final step, because after this step, we do another testing for disruptions using the same method as for the associations. So here's how the result could look like. Here we observe a break at the time of the change, and we evaluate it as statistically significant. So we would go back to the fundamental association table and redefine or improve the correspondences to just reflect the statistical content of the exchange. And once we are done with this, we have solved problems related to the ICD change. What's left is another round of checks and corrections if needed. And this stage is called a posteriori corrections. And this is applying corrections, usually very, very simple, just transferring a portion of one disease to another based on some known information, on some confirmation that we are allowed to do it because we know that something happened, something related to coding or to instructions, or to the collection of the deaths. And this is an example from the reconstruction of check data and how it looks before and after. So these changes are not connected to the ICD change, but to some instructions, changes in coding. So to summarize, ICD revisions represent a huge problem in the cause-specific analysis, but can be overcome by careful reconstruction of medical and statistical content. Also, the coding-related changes can be identified and eventually solved, but not 100%. There are always cases where we are not sure what happened and we cannot justify the correction. Very often, we see comparability and continuity issues for poorly defined items, which are famous under the name of garbage codes. And the human causative database, which was the center of this talk, gathers all available reconstructed time series so far, including rich documentation of methods and data sources, and it's free to use, so you are welcome to use it. Here's the link, and I thank you for attention, and thanks for all the collaborators, the contributors to the HCD, and see you later. Bye.
So thank you very much, Marketa, for this very detailed and I think methodological presentation, but so maybe not everybody was able to follow all these details, but at least I think it gives a very good idea of the amount of work which is behind this reconstruction of coherent series of deaths by cause for different countries and a lot of different international classification or revisions of the international classification of disease. I don't, is there any specific question on this presentation? I see that in the chat, Giancarlo added a reference which could be of interest for those who want to know more on these different steps of the method. No, everything was clear, so this is perfect. And maybe we will now turn to some part of the session with real results after dealing with all these methodological issues and data issues. And we will now listen to Hiram Beltran Sanchez, which will present some analysis on COVID-19, relying partly on our databases on on deaths by COVID. So, Nancy.
So thank you for the introduction, and I want to thank Franz and everybody who invited me to be here, Ariana, and everyone who made this session possible. So what I'm presenting today is a work that was joined with my colleague Samerson Eji, Jay Wang Zhang, and Caroline Mann. So this is an application of using the INED, the demographic of COVID death. So we're going to be presenting some of the results at the population level. So what we have in here, population level mortality reporting from COVID-19 in Europe and North America. So here is a quick outline of what I'll be presenting, a little bit of background, although by now we might not need a lot of background given the extent of the pandemic. I'll focus then on data, results, a little bit of the conclusions. But what I really want to spend a little more time, given the focus of this session, is on general thoughts on the data development, in particular how this data has been quite useful and quite important for the work that we were able to do with this in this paper in particular. So a little bit of the background, just want to keep your mind that when we did this paper, it was back in 2020. So we updated the paper early in 2021. So just to remind you that back then there were several indicators that had been used early on to get a sense of the impact of the pandemic, in particular, trying to get a sense of the lethality of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the indicators were along the lines of case fatality rates, and they seem to indicate that there was quite a high mortality from COVID-19. However, as demographers, we tend to look more at the population level impact, and that needed a different type of indicator, what we usually compute as death rates. So we needed to know more about these population level indicators and how the death rate by age and by sex might be different, and how those differences could be emerging across countries. So the goal of the paper that we wrote was quite relatively simple. Again, I want you to keep in mind, this was in the late 2020. The first was, let's compute the age-specific death rates by sex and country, standardize them, because as we know, that's quite a relevant indicator to take into account the size of those populations. I'll show you a figure that indicates that. So we could have a more appropriate way of comparing the death rates across countries. And thirdly, the idea was, what if we look at the death rates prior to the pandemic? Is there an association between the countries who that had low mortality rates prior to the pandemic? Do they also tend to experience slightly lower lethality from COVID-19? With the idea that, again, going back to 2020, was populations that tended to be a little bit sicker in the sense that they had higher prevalence of diseases could potentially be affected the most from the pandemic. So the data we use is this data repository from INED, the Demography of COVID-19 Deaths database. We access this data from the early creation in the February 2020 to early February 2021. So we got the number of deaths that were confirmed from COVID-19 for these different countries. Back then, Canada was not yet included. So we got the data from Canada from these official statistics. So that's a little bit of a caveat in the sense that we did not corroborate it at the level that Jenny already mentioned. They have been doing this data gathering at the INED database. But in any case, we use the data from Canada. Population counts came from the Human Mortality Database, another data repository. And in order to get some idea of the population sizes in 2020, we use this population projection from the United Nations. For the comparative purposes, as I mentioned, we also look at data from 2017. We took some of that data from Eurostat, which is the agency that tends to collect data for these European countries, from Canada, the respective statistical offices, and all-cause mortality from the Human Mortality Database. So I'm going to show you a few results, because as I said, what I really want to focus a little bit more on is on the usefulness of having this type of data sets that allows one to compute these death rates and start making comparisons across countries and by sex. So the methods were relatively simple in the sense of just getting these specific death rates, standardized those death rates, annualize the crude death rate to, again, get a sense of the impact. So the main idea behind is, let's get a sense of the age pattern of mortality. Let's compare across countries once we age standardize them. And then let's get a sense of the mortality level by getting this crude death rate on an annualized basis, because the data that we have is mainly coming from 2020. So quick set of results that we think were quite relevant. When we look at the age-specific mortality rates, age is on the x-axis and the y-axis shows the number of deaths per 100,000. We're seeing here for 6 main countries. The US is here, Germany is at the bottom, and the other ones are in between. France is somewhere here in orange. So the important thing for us as demographers is, one, once we look at these death rates by age, we see that they tend to follow the typical pattern that one might expect to observe in mortality rates, except perhaps that we don't have the typical large increase in infant mortality, because in this particular case, COVID-19 did not seem to have a large impact among children. So what we see, however, is once we get this type of data that allows to get at the nuance of estimating death rates by age, we actually see that there could be some large differences in the rates. This is in a logarithmic scale, so the magnitude might not look as large, but there is indeed quite a large difference. For example, there are differences in death rates between the US and Germany, which are the opposite lines. 113 deaths per 100,000 in the US versus 41.7 in Germany among people in their mid-50s. So this is more than twice higher death rate among people in their 50s in the US relative to Germany. So again, there is the importance of having this type of data repository that allows to then get at the nuance of the impact on mortality by age. If one then standardizes these rates to try to make sense of the lethality of COVID-19 across countries, here is one of the figures that one gets. In the x-axis, we now have the age standardized death rate in the 100,000 units per person years. The countries are on the left-hand side, and the width of each bar represents the population, the proportional to the population size of each country. So here is with the importance of standardizing the death rates, because the US, it's a fairly large rectangle, because it's a very massive country in terms of population size, in contrast to, say, Scotland, that is fairly narrow rectangle. So what this indicates as we compare these countries in these age standardized death rates is that the impact of COVID-19, at least during 2020, was quite large in the US. It seemed to be quite large in Belgium and Scotland, but these are populations that are fairly small in size. In contrast, we have countries like France and Germany, two of the largest countries in terms of population size in Europe, in which the crude death rate, the standardized one, was less than half or even 1/3 of what the US was experiencing back then. Then we did the interesting exercise of what if we looked at the association between all-cause mortality rates in 2017. This is a pre-COVID-19 health status kind of idea. And here is the death rates, the equivalent death rates now in 2020, estimated from the data that we had up to that point. The idea is it the case that countries who initially in 2017, the pre-pandemic period, had lower age standardized death rates, do they also tend to have lower COVID-19 age standardized death rates? And it looks like there was indeed the case that countries that prior to the pandemic were in a slightly better health status in terms of the age standardized death rates tend to have much lower mortality as a result of the pandemic. And the US is one of the countries in which we clearly see that because they had high age standardized death rates, meaning underlying health conditions were perhaps quite prevalent, then they also had quite large impact. The size of the circles, again, is proportional to population size to emphasize the large size of the US relative to the other countries. So what I think is important to keep in mind with this type of analysis is that we found there was a large heterogeneity in these COVID-19 death rates across countries. That's an important difference relative to the indicators that were used prior to this point in terms of case fatality rates. So now we put them within a population level perspective. It was importantly that when we look at leading causes of death in these populations, up to that point, for instance, COVID-19 was already getting to the top causes of death. It was the second leading cause of death behind cancer, for instance, in England and Wales and France. And it was the third cause of death in the US that was also behind cancer and heart disease. So this is a way of getting at the impact and the magnitude of COVID-19 at the population level, that despite being fairly recent, it has reached the kind of the top in terms of the lethality relative to other causes of death. It looks like, based on the information we had, although we did not link it directly to mortality rates, but it seems to be that early and successful containment and mitigation measures may have an impact on why some countries had lower impact of COVID-19. We haven't reproduced the results yet more recently, now that we have had access to vaccinations, which most likely have had quite a large impact on these levels. And as of 2020, it looked like these countries like England, Wales, France, Italy, and the US in particular were experiencing quite a high mortality burden from the pandemic. So in the remaining of the talk, in the 2 or 3 minutes left, I just wanted to bring some general thoughts on the data development. I have had some experience creating data repositories that we can make accessible for the research community and for the public in general. So I think what I have found quite nice and interesting in this data source from INED, the data is harmonized. So that is quite important as one tries to do research on these issues, in particular mortality issues. Because early on, when I was looking at the data, for instance, you might remember the WHO was providing data for countries where it was all over the place. It was not harmonized. Countries were reporting the data in very different formats, different ages, different time periods, and so on and so forth. So having this data in a harmonized form is quite useful. Second, and this is from a demography perspective, and I think this is where the INED data set is fitting a quite particular niche in the sense of providing data inputs that we in demography need to have the level of detail in terms of sex and ages. It is by age group, which is perfectly fine because it allows one to still get a sense of how mortality rates look like, but in some instances, we might be able to get it at the finer level of detail. It continually updates the data. So this is, again, highly relevant during a pandemic period because things could be changing quite rapidly, as we have seen recently in some European countries in which it looks like the pandemic is again picking up. So having these continuous updates allows to keep tracking the impact of the mortality of COVID-19. And again, when I emphasize the demographic approach, which is at the population level. It is fully documented, which is again very nice because one might want to look at the data in a slightly different way, and then we can go into the documentation to get a sense of how that information was put together and what sources were used, as Jenny already described, all different processes that go behind the scenes to get the data ready. And last but not least, it is very easy to access. So that's something that as a former developer of data, it takes quite some time to make the data friendly, to make sure that individuals from all sorts of backgrounds will be able to download and to use. So I really like these interfaces that they had in which one can look at the data availability and comparability over time, which makes the download and usage of this data quite easy. So I want to congratulate the people who are involved in getting this data ready because it allows people like me to use it and to start making sense of some of these results in this particular case from the pandemic. So I want to thank you again for inviting me to present and to be part of this panel. Here is my email if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiram, for this interesting presentation and also nice appreciation of the database and what can be done from this data. I am looking if we have some questions in the chat or people raising hands. No, you have just applause. So this is already something nice, I think. I just wanted maybe just to reinforce what you said about the strength of the database and the update, because it shows that we are trying, and maybe Jenny or Ariana would like to insist on that, but we are trying to update this database on deaths by COVID-19, following the last developments, but also adding new sources when they arrive, or better sources. And I was thinking of that especially for France, for instance. I think when you use this data, we had only the data coming from the health system, which were not covering the whole population or the whole deaths. And now we are also providing in the database data coming from the civil registration and the cause of death statistics, which are more precise. And so I thought when listening to you that it would be interesting to compare now, redoing the job with the most recent updated data, even for the past, to see how we gain in precision and and especially according to this distribution by age, that as you told, was for us very important at the beginning. It seemed to us that we had a lot of total numbers of deaths, but for demographers, if you don't have age, you cannot say a lot. And so thank you very much for this. No other question or comment? So let's turn to our last presentation tonight, which is today by Francesco Villavicencio. So, sorry for the pronunciation. And we'll end this session with a presentation on the international database on longevity, or at least results from the IDL. So Francesco and Nancy, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Franz and Ariana for inviting me to be part of this session. When I was invited to give a talk, I was part of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Now I work at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona. So that's why you see so many logos in this front page. So today I'm going to present the International Database on Longevity, give some a brief overview about it, and then discuss some work we've done by analyzing mortality irregularities at the frontier of human longevity. That means among the oldest individuals. So most of the results I will present today are already published. Specifically on a paper that was published last summer, in which Jesus Adrián Álvarez was the leading author. And then we also had Cosmos Trozza and Giancarlo Camà. In this paper, we analyzed irregularities in human mortality after age 105 using data from the IDL. So what's the IDL? So the International Database on Longevity is a result of a concerted effort to provide thorough and validated information on individuals who have attained extreme ages. And here you have the link to access to this database. So it was first launched in 2010, and at that time it provided information on 672 exhaustively validated cases of supercentenarians. And by supercentenarians, we mean individuals aged 110 plus. And it was hosted at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock, Germany. So that was 2010, and then almost a decade later, there was a revision and expansion of the IDL. And this revision, mainly, I will say the most important feature is that there was an extension of data collection to include, not for all countries, but for some of them, the records of people who had attained age 105. And in this case, they were labeled or named as semi-supercentenarians. So at present, the database has more than 13,000 records from 13 countries. I think for 10 of them, they have data starting at 105, and for 3 of them, only starting at 110. And mostly there are European countries, United States, and Quebec, and Japan. So, and together with this expansion of the IDL, the database moved to INED in Paris. So both the launching of the database in 2010 and the expansion almost a decade later were came together with 2 monographs that were led by Heiner Meyer as the main editor, in which several authors contributed to these monographs, in which they give details about the different specifics of the different countries, how the data validation was carried out, and the main characteristics of the IDL. And of course, there were, in addition to this, there were some chapters that focused on specific analyses, mainly on mortality, that were carried out using this data. So this is what we can say about briefly about the IDL. Of course, these books are both open access as well as the IDL, so you can freely download them from the Springer webpage, and the data you can download from the link I showed earlier. I would say that perhaps I'm not the main motivation, but one of the main motivations perhaps to build this database was to try to answer to the question whether there is a mortality deceleration among the oldest humans, And there are diversity of arguments or opinions or studies regarding this topic. So in the first monograph I just mentioned from 2010, Jutta Gamper is the author of one of the chapters, in which she concludes that human mortality after age 110 is flat at a level corresponding to an annual probability of death of 50%. That means that if we have 200 individuals that reach 110, their chances of surviving to 111 is like tossing a coin. Let's say that they all toss a coin, 50% will survive and reach 111, 50% will die. And so the same for the following ages until all the 200 individuals die. So that was the analysis Gampe did in 2010, but then 7 years later, Gavrilova and colleagues used exactly the same data, the 672 individuals from the earliest version of the IDL, and conclude completely the opposite, completely the opposite results, that hazard rates continue to grow after age 110 years and follow the Gompertz law. So this was quite striking to us, that same data, but completely different results. And here you can see the results, one of the figures in the work by Gavrilova and colleagues, in which they estimate central death rates on a quarterly year intervals. Those are the dots, and then fitted Gompertz model to this data. Here you see a line because it's log scale, and they conclude that there is enough evidence to reject the hypothesis of flat mortality. That means that mortality increases over age. So we have these two opposite results from the same data. Then we wonder who was right. That was the first question. And then the second question was what about uncertainty? Because one will think that when we have these databases with very few individuals, it might be relevant or imperative to correctly assess the uncertainty of the mortality estimates. And in a first step, that's what I did in a work together with Jose Manuel Aburto, in which we reproduced the analysis by Gavrilova and colleagues. So this figure is analogous, is exactly the same as the previous one, but we incorporated the uncertainty surrounding the central death rates. And to obtain these uncertainty intervals, we adopted like a bootstrapping data simulation approach. And two key messages from this figure. First is that as we move on, as people for higher ages, the uncertainty increases. For example, in this point here, that is age 114.75, there were only 4 individuals alive and only 1 death observed. So once we try to assess the uncertainty, in fact, we get all the range of possible probabilities of death. Here, because in logarithmic scale, this goes to -infinity, so it's not shown, but this means that any possible age of death, probability of death is possible. And for the last age group in 115, we will have 3 individuals. And here we assume, following what Gavrilova and colleagues did, that the probability of death is 1. That's why we don't see any uncertainty here. So as we move on up with age, we have more uncertainty. And the second point is that if we believe that these data points of higher ages have too much uncertainty, then it might not be appropriate to use the estimated central death rates and fit a Gompertz model to those central death rates. So we thought, okay, let's try to suppress the higher ages. And if we fit Gompertz only to the black points, then what we obtained was that there was not evidence to reject the hypothesis of flat mortality, just with the dot, with the black points. Of course, this is completely arbitrary to pick this age or another, but what we wanted to convey the idea is that it's not, it might not be appropriate to just simply estimate, fit a model to some central death rates that hide a lot of uncertainty. So that was our previous work before we started the paper I mentioned at the beginning with Jesus, Adrian Alvarez, and the rest of us. So we had these two opposite points of view about mortality after age 110. We had the issue about uncertainty, and then there was this expansion of the IDL from 672 records to more than 13,000. Then we thought, okay, now we have to do what we should do is take all this data, new data, try to estimate central death rates, try to assess uncertainty and see who is right, see whether we can observe or not a leveling of a mortality deceleration. And that's exactly what we did. And I will say that the three main points or contributions of our paper are: first is that we estimate the age trajectories of the risk of dying after age 105 on a fully non-parametric framework. So all our results are data driven. We didn't make any assumption about the data. We didn't try to fit a parametric model, say Gompers, to the data. We just let the data talk. The second is that we accurately assessed uncertainty surrounding those mortality estimates. And here we adopted the same approach that I just mentioned about like a bootstrapping kind approach to assess the uncertainty of the central death rates. And the third point is that for the first time, we were able, and I think that was not ever done before, we were able to produce country-specific estimates for a considerable amount of countries. So of course, there were studies that focus on a given country, the US, or for example, the famous paper by Barbie et al., in which they analyzed Italian data. But here we were able to have several countries with standardized data and compare them all. So let's go to the results. So this is just a descriptive overview of the data. In the central panel, we have all the individuals from the IDL, and then we have some females are in red, males are in blue. You can see that there are much more females on the database, and those who have darker colors are fully observed. That means that we know their ages at death, and those who have lighter, so more light colors, these are partially observed. That means that they might be right censored. And these histograms, what they show is the age at last observation. And what we observe from this big central panel is that there is like, it suggests like an exponential decline in the number of survivors by age, which might call for an underlying constant risk of death. But of course, here we are putting together many countries from different cohorts. So what we see in the other small panels, the country-specific panels, are the estimates for each of each country separately. And then in this case, for example, France is the country with more observations in the IDL, 8,900 women and 800 men. And in this case, we still see this pattern. We see this exponential decline in the number of survivors, also for Germany and Belgium. In the case of the United States, we only included data for from 110 onwards. We still can see some exponential decline, perhaps also in Denmark. And for the last three, Quebec, Austria, and Norway, we didn't have enough, there are not enough data points, observations, records to observe this exponential decline. But nonetheless, key message from this figure is that when more data is available, more suggestions of an exponential decline. So the next step, once we were able to have this descriptive overview of the data, was to estimate the central death rates. rates. And that's what you can see in the following slide. So here we have estimated central death rates for females for the 8 countries. And they are sorted by number of observations. So that's why France is first, and the last one up until Norway. And key message again here. So the more data we have for a given country, the more evidence or that there is a flatter or leveling off in the risk of dying. For example, if we observe France, when we have enough observations from 105 up to 110, so more than 100 observations, survivors, here the risk of death oscillates between 0.6 and 0.8. And we have relatively narrow confidence intervals, especially at the earliest ages. The same can be said about Germany and Belgium, also for the United States for the first 3, from 110 to 111.5, and then for the remaining countries, there are fewer observations. You can see this by the color of the dots. So the light dots is less than 10 observations, which hide a lot of uncertainty. We were still able to estimate some death rates, but uncertainty increases with age. So conclusions from this study. We believe that there is evidence of regularities in the age pattern of mortality after 105. None of the populations analyzed in this study indicate a rapid increase in mortality hazard after age 105. So this will be more in line with GAMP's results rather than results obtained by Gavrilova and colleagues, who suggested an exponential increase in mortality after age 110. And most of all is that as more data are available, which is the case of France, there is more evidence of a leveling off. This is in strike contrast with some criticism to the hypothesis that of a leveling off that have argued that the leveling off is observed because of bad quality data or because only a few number of observations. Here we have we observe completely the opposite. The more data we have for a country or for a given age, more evidence of a leveling off. So these data-driven studies in which we estimate mortality, the central death rates only using our data without any assumptions on the model, we will say that is in line with this the theory of an asymptotic mortality plateau that are suggested by some theoretical methods that argue that perhaps the plateau is never reached, but there are minimal increases that will make mortality rates getting closer to a asymptotic mortality plateau. So thank you very much for your attention. This is the Twitter accounts of 3 of the co-authors of the paper. Giancarlo is an outlaw and he doesn't have Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pancho, for this presentation and this new contribution to a debate which is far from being closed, I think, on this shape of the mortality curve at old ages. And also, I think it's very clear in what you present the importance of gathering more data and more data of good quality. And I think this is one of the main aim of this international database on longevity. And we will try to go on in this direction to provide more interesting data to all researchers who are interested in this topic. We are not far from the end of this session, but of course, please, if there are any questions in the audience, people are there, but not really reacting. I just wanted to tell you that you will find in the chat several references which are given on the different papers which were cited during this presentation. So feel free to have a look at that, and also feel free to have a look at the links to our different databases, and please disseminate this information all around you. We were not so numerous today at this session, but I hope that these databases will become more and more famous in time, and it's very important, I think, that all people who are aware of the existence of these databases speak of them and recommend their utilization. And of course, we would like very much to get returns from all of the users to know what is working correctly, what you would like to improve, and so on, because I think it's very important to have this permanent dialogue between users and data producers. I just wanted to, there was one question in the chat for Marketa. So Marketa, there was a question by Svetlana Poniakina about the implementation of ICD 11. When we see the complexity of the change, when there is a new revision of the ICD, and we know that the WHO has now adopted a new revision, ICD 11. Have you an idea of its implementation, or which country will be the first one to implement ICD 11? Do we know about that? Has it already started? Marketa?
So I don't know. I don't think any country is using ICD 11 now, but I think the deadline is the 1st January 2022. It's the first date since when the countries will be able to adopt ICD 11. So there is a deadline. It's in 1 year from now. And what I know is that there is a lot of preparations, because the change will be really very significant, including the logic of the classification, including some genetic axes and new axes of classification. So it will be a big change, which is bad news for us in a way, but there's still some time, I think, and it will not be immediate, probably, the adoption. So for that.
Yeah, I think that as users, we are not so, for us, it's not so urgent to have this new version implemented. And I heard from some people in charge of the cause of death statistics that they are not also very, for them, it's not also very urgent to implement this new version, which will probably introduce new disruptions in the series, and a lot of new problems. If somebody has something to say, it's still time. It's exactly 6:30 for me. I don't know, 5:30 at UTC time. So
they can also unmute if they want. I think it's
who?
If they want to ask questions directly, they can unmute themselves without writing in the chat.
Yes, of course, you can ask questions directly if possible, but we don't see anybody. So maybe I will now decide to close this session, to thank all presenters for playing the game and presenting their very interesting papers. I would like also to thank the interpreters who were with us all this time, and Nancy, our technical support. Thanks to her, everything ran smoothly, I think, and we were able to get all these contributions and to hear this very interesting presentation. So thank you to everybody. Please feel free to contact Ariana or me or all the presenters if you want to discuss more about these issues, or to develop some research on our databases, and we will try to go on in that direction. So thank you very much to all of you, and have a nice International Population Conference. Bon congrès international de la population.
Thank you very much, Franz. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ariana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Greetings.